if you would allow me to move out of my science mind more into just a bigger picture for a moment, is in my hospice care, sitting with hundreds and thousands of patients over the many years who are dying from any number of diseases or just failing health at 105 years of age. Those patients get to demonstrate a birth in that moment that is so beautiful. It is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed as a physician, is this thing that we call death. Be with them and witness their rebirth. Because what is rebirthing is not a biological body, it's an energetic soul. Literally, you get to see an energetic awareness, consciousness emerge from that person, and they will say things in those last couple minutes. They suddenly wake up, and in a moment of lucidity, they will heal a relationship with a estranged family member, and they will say, I love you, I am sorry, it is beautiful on this side, and I'm moving into it with joy. And in those few words, and then they go back to sleep and they pass away. In those few words, they engender that family now with a new sense of hope and a new healing that happens. And so we need to take this death moment of our species, and we need to speak wisely to one another and see that we are not just biological bodies that are failing on a planet that is failing its biology. And when we have that separation moment, that will change our relationship to Mother Nature, and we will reintegrate.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Zach Bush, the American physician and educator who specializes in the symbiotic relationship between human and environmental health. In 2019, you correctly predicted that Hubei in central China would be the origin of the next global pandemic due to its high levels of toxic pollution. You now predict COVID-19 will clear naturally by the summer of 2021 and that a vaccine is not needed to eradicate the coronavirus. Throughout the pandemic, you've spoken out against needless lockdowns, ineffective face masks, and the blatant misdiagnosis of the virus. Dr. Bush, welcome to London Real.
Gave away all my punchlines. I like it.
Don't worry, we're going to come back to that. Before we get started, I just want to announce that we are streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me repeat that. Can everyone watching us please share this link via the sidebar to all your social media channels? Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. Dr. Bush, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anybody in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Bush. Thanks to the generous donations of over 33,000 people around the world that I affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Dr. Bush, I'm super excited to have you here today. Lots of stuff to cover, but there was a quote that you said recently that really struck in my head. And I think you said something to the effect of that we've created a tyranny of fear for something that has the death rate of a flu. Give me your thoughts on the last 3 months. I mean, now that you've had a little time to digest it all, what do you make of all of this? And is this fear something you still feel that's out there in a big way?
I think the fear is going to continue to build until we wake up from the dream we've put ourselves into as humanity here. But the fear is something that's been baked into our mindset since really the origin and beginning of time. And so I am really thrilled to imagine a scenario where humans are so empowered with their own capacity to change and transform that there's only a call to action and only a call for opportunity rather than a call to fear and paranoia. And to get there, we're going to have to really reconsider the worst case scenarios, which is ultimately death. And we've seen a lot of people die this last few months in relationship to a virus that's come around the world. And those deaths have been predictable in that we are on course towards the extinction of our species. And so as we really come to terms with the fact that extinction means death, I think that that's somehow been lacking from our general consciousness when we say global warming and collapse of climate, and we've lost 40% of life on Earth, and we're losing a species to extinction every 20 minutes. All these statistics get thrown at us all the time, and it doesn't sink in that means we're going to die, And so in the end, we're afraid of something that's happening around us because we don't understand it or we don't feel the opportunity to change it. And so this has been the most extraordinary example of a whole planet now, 7 billion people strong, going into that fear paradigm.
Yeah, it's a deep thing when you think about, well, first of all, death is part of life. I mean, I don't think a lot of people ever want to even think about that. We keep ourselves busy usually, so we don't have to consider that reality. Now we've had a lot of time to think, and then we're being faced with this thing that we thought at first was going to cause a significant amount of death. Now it looks like statistically it's less. But your point is that if we don't change our behavior, we're all going to go anyways.
Yeah. And it's not personal in the sense that the planet is collapsing in its biologic capacity to produce life. And this kind of harkens back in some ways to imagine those early Star Trek movies where you've got Captain Kirk landing on these distant planets and they're trying to decide, is this habitable to life? This is literally one of those planets that miraculously had all of the right ingredients for life to happen. It had carbon that could be changed in form to create backbone of biology. It had water that could then animate that carbon life form. And it has energy in the shape of a sun that's just close enough to the Earth to charge the Earth's surface with photonic energy so that biology would be powered into this animated state of water and carbon. And life would then generate through the origin of viruses. And the viruses would slowly build life on the planet into an extraordinary biodiversity and adaptive biology that's capable of everything. And now we see the underpinnings of that collapse. And it is because we are disrupting the carbon soil systems, the water, and the air that we breathe. And on this trajectory, Captain Kirk lands in a few hundred years and finds a planet that's no longer habitable by not just humans, but any large biology. And we'll be back down into bacteria, fungi, and a few species of algae that can still bloom in acidic oceans. And so we are backing ourselves back to the origins of this planet or other planets where they are in this inhabitable space. And with that, I think that we have a hard time imagining what it looks like to get from now to that point of complete collapse. And this pandemic is a very minor ripple effect. This is like that little early tremor in the collapse of a species. And this, the death tolls that happened came nowhere near challenging the human population, the species continued growth, our population rise. It couldn't touch any of that because it really affected most of all people over the age of 75 that were at high mortality likelihood in this 12-month period anyways. And so there was no change in the trajectory of the cancer-like growth of human species from this virus. So this virus is not what causes extinction. There is no virus, I would posit, that can cause extinction. Extinction has to be an undermining instead of the fundamentals of health. Disease doesn't end health. It's the collapse of health that welcomes in disease. And that's what we've seen with this pandemic.
Wow. And, when you started talking about the fact that it was the pollution that caused I guess, the virus spreading. And maybe you can tell me more specifically about what you mean by that. I mean, how do people react? Because that's not the narrative that we're being told on our governments. I'm sure if we said this right now on YouTube, I'd be censored. You know, when you start putting these ideas out there, well, first of all, what did people say initially? And second of all, have people started to come around and started to listen to more of your ideas?
Yeah, and I want to be clear that these aren't like just my ideas. I'm not just some, self-proclaimed clever person. Like, I've got a whole, backing of scientists and, physicians and everything else that have been working around me for years. And we are just one of many groups around the world that are really working to understand the role of soil, water, and air systems in human biology. We happen to be focused on the microbiome, which is the bacteria and the fungi and all of these organisms. And when we started this, mission 10 years ago, it was crickets. I actually was still at the University of Virginia at the time, and I did one big, keynote talk there that had the word healing in it, and nobody showed up. And, it's like, but the following month I did one called cancer, and it was packed. And so the mentality of the science community, including myself at that time, was that we are here to stamp out disease. But the idea of health and healing is remote and feels new agey or somehow like, fake science. And so that's an extraordinary mistake we made in medical education over the last 100 years, was to forget the opportunity to create such resilient health that we would be resistant to disease. Instead, we focused all of our trillions of dollars of research and development and trillions of hours of manpower, research and ingenuity and intuition on disease management instead of health. And so the result is what you see around you. And so the reason the dialogue looks like it is in the government and the WHO and the CDC and the UK system there, you guys are part of this big machine of fear that we created as physicians as well. And so as physicians and scientists, we have created the fight against cancer and the fear of bacterial infections, the fear of viral infections, when in fact, none of that's really underpinned by the current science. Science has radically changed in the last 20 years, and it hasn't trickled down into the mindset of the physicians, the scientists, and especially the clinicians yet. And so generally, we expect that to take 20 to 30 years to make a transition. But this has been such a radical shift that's come through our understanding of genomics and our ability to look at genomic sequencing of nature, that we're starting to realize we were wrong. We're not at the center of the earth. And this is very much akin to that moment when in the 1600s, the telescope would prove that we were not at the center of the universe. We thought in 1605, we thought the earth was flat and sat in the middle of the universe, and it kind of came around us. And back in the Greek, Pythagoras, there was a theory that it was a round planet, but it was still a theory 2,000 years ago. And by 1600 years later, it hadn't really changed. There were still a lot of people that saw it as a flat earth, and today we still have flat earth society. And so there's this very slow adoption of understanding as science makes a paradigm leap as big as saying, we're not the center of the universe. The solar system is actually rotating around the sun, not us. It's the same way it's going to potentially take hundreds of years for us to adopt the realization in our technologies, in our medicine, in our energy systems, transportation, education, that we are not at the center of biology. We are the result of biology. We are actually like this distant, long-laid sequelae or symptom of biology on Earth. The intelligence that we see the human capacity reaching is the result of billions of years of biologic progress. And that biologic progress has been accelerated, in fact, by biologic collapse. And that's why Hubei was such a predictable incident. And that when you see extinction level stress, and to find that, you want to find disruption of soil, water, and air. Disrupt soil, water, and air systems, you're now pushing extinction event fast. And nowhere do we have that happening in the world faster than Central China. And so Central China has managed to adopt Western farming practices that has accelerated the death of soil there worse than anywhere else. And then Beijing and all of its energy and transportation has pushed an enormous amount of air pollution down into Hubei. And so you have this perfect toxic stew of dead and dying soils, the largest pork antibiotic production system in the world, coupled with this air pollution. And so you're killing soil, water, and air in a single place. And when you do that, the response is adaptation. And biology goes into an explosive effort to find loopholes, to find alternative biologic pathways to avoid the toxicity, to try not to go extinct. And so in an extinction event, you're going to see an explosion of genetic intelligence. You're going to see variants coming out of all niches of biology to create adaptation for resilient recovery from an extinction event. And that's what we've seen. 5 big extinction events on the planet in the past. And every time they happen, we come back as a planet more diverse, more biologically intelligent, because of the viral explosion of intelligence that happens around us in an extinction event. And so this coronavirus and any naturally occurring virus is actually an adaptation event towards the next opportunity for explosion of life on Earth. And because we're only halfway through this extinction event, I'm excited to imagine that we could stop our behavior, realign, and witness an explosion of biologic diversity, biologic resilience on this planet that's never been witnessed in 4 billion years. It could be really explosively exciting.
Wow, this is exciting to think about. And so because the environment was so stressed over there in China, this particular coronavirus just naturally emerged, like to almost fill a void there. And so in that sense, it was predictable. It didn't necessarily come from a lab or all these places. And maybe you can explain that a little bit more to like the layman of how that could just happen there, or how that coronavirus can just become present.
Yeah. So I guess a little bit of background on what is a virus first. A virus is not a living organism. And so we have severely miscategorized viruses as physicians and scientists as part of the microbiome. And you don't need to be a scientist to look up the words micro and biome. Micro meaning small, biome meaning living organisms. And so microbiome is a description of living organisms that are microscopic, meaning these ancient bacteria-like guys called archaea, then bacteria, then fungi, then protozoa, parasites. This extraordinary universe out there, and they so outnumber any biologic life the size of a human. This massive biology and life within the microbiome is huge. There's thought to be now 3.5 to 5 million species of just fungi. It's just like this extraordinary explosion of capacity and adaptation within the fungal kingdom alone. The viruses are not alive and therefore should not be categorized, as far as I'm concerned, in the microbiome, because they're not living organisms. They are a secretion of bacteria and multicellular organisms. And so if they come from bacteria, we happen to call them bacteriophage, but it's just a virus. And then coming out of a human system, for example, or another mammal, we call them viruses. But these are genetic secretions of living cells that don't pass any life capacity within that package of information. It's literally a communication tool for the genome to proliferate, to create adaptation and biodiversity. And so it is the device, it is the tool for life to quickly adapt and shift into a more intelligent life form. And so a virus is a package of genetic information that's targeted. This is the really fascinating thing. This isn't like just like oozing of genetic information. It's wrapped up just like a smart bomb to deliver the information right to the right place where it's most needed. And in the case of coronavirus, which has been around with us for, documented for over 740 years in interesting approach to record keeping and genomics, all the way back to potentially 1,200 years ago, one case. So coronavirus has been around for probably thousands of years, but we've been able to document it back to that far back. And so it's a very common part of the human experience. Coronavirus has caused many of the common colds we experience, etc. When an organism in great stress has the need for an adaptation, it can take something like a coronavirus and misspell the genetic information within that. And the misspelling will accelerate as the stress increases. And so it does this by actually intentionally having slightly sloppy machinery for repeating the genetic information within the viral genome. And so as the virome, as this extensive genomic collection of information starts to misspell, many of those will be irrelevant, just misspellings, and will go on to do nothing. Occasionally, you'll see an upregulation of function or an important structural adaptation represented in that genomic information. And therefore, when it enters an organism like a human, we take it into our genomics and we start to proliferate it out there to expand that information stream. And so, as we saw with corona and the vast majority of viruses on the planet, it's asymptomatic in almost all individuals that get it. And then a very small section of people will develop severe symptoms and disease and either become ill and recover or die. The pathway towards that is very regulated. And so viruses, we have this belief system, even as scientists, that, they're like these Trojan horses that come in and take over the mechanisms of our human cells to proliferate. It's nowhere near that reality. If that was true, we would have never existed, because there are 10 to the 31 viruses in the air that we breathe. There are 10 to the 31, and 10 to the 31, we're not good at math as a population. That's 1 with 31 zeros after it. Right? Remember, a billion is 9 zeros, and so 31 zeros on the end of that, and you're now 10 million times more viruses in the air than are stars in the entire universe, to put this in perspective, okay? And so then we look into the soils and we find another 10 to the 30 viruses there. And then we look into the ocean water and we find another 10 to the 31 viruses there. And so we are so surrounded by this genetic information that if it actually behaved such that every time it touched us, it would take over our machinery and just for its own good start to proliferate, we would never exist. We are the result of viruses. We are not being attacked by viruses. And when I say that, that's quite literal. With the recent genomic sequencing, we're now getting good at understanding which parts of our DNA were inserted directly by viruses. And we are now have counted up to more than 50% of the human genes resulting from direct viral updates. And at least 10% of our genes are direct viral updates from retroviruses like HIV. And so over the last 100 years, we have demonized the very mechanisms by which we have become real. And that's a terrifying mistake to make, because when your paradigm is so reversed as a scientist that you are taught to fear and attack the very things that built you, you are now going to engineer your own extinction. And we have done that through the advent of antimicrobials, antivirals, antifungals, and the like. Now, there's many doctors listening right now who are saying, well, that's got to be BS, because I see patients dying of pneumonia, and if I give them an antibiotic, they improve. This is where we, again, fail to see the big picture, and we start to measure outcomes by 2 weeks instead of 2 years or 20 years in these individuals. And what we now know is that a single course of antibiotics undermines human biology immediately as we destroy the fabric of the organic soil of our microbiome. A single course of antibiotics has now been documented to increase your risk of major depression in the next 12 months by 17%, your risk of major anxiety disorder by 24%. If you get 2 courses of antibiotics in the next year, over a 12-month period, your risk of major depression event is now 44%. Your risk of a massive anxiety disorder is 52% higher. So it's this radical undermining of our brain and our neurologic function when we just take an antibiotic. But more terrifyingly, if you look at the United States, I've shown these maps thousands of times to audiences, but you can look at the antibiotic prescription rate per state within the United States and show a perfect correlation to the risk of death from cancer in those states. So the higher the rate of antibiotic prescription, the more likely you die from cancer.
Why is that?
The short-sighted.
Why is that direct correlation with cancer?
Yeah, it's an important question that started to emerge in around 2005 and 2010. So 15 years ago, we started to get enough genomic sequencing capacity looking at the gut microbiome for the first time, which we discovered was an entire universe of intelligence within our gut. And in that, we started to realize that people that were missing specific species of bacteria within their gut flora were at very high risk for specific cancers. Meaning if you lose these types of bacteria, you'll get breast cancer. If you lose these types of bacteria, you'll get colon cancer. If you lose these bacteria, you'll get prostate cancer. And so it was very specific. It wasn't like a general, poor bacteria means cancer. It was very specific, cancer specific. And that was actually the turning point of my career. I started to study nutrition. I had been doing cancer chemotherapy research at the University of Virginia. I was developing a new chemotherapy from vitamin A compounds. And in that march into vitamin A, I started to study nutrition for the first time. And in that journey, it became obvious that I had totally missed the boat. I had gotten completely confused in my own journey as to what cancer was and how we would treat it. And that sobering moment where you realize not a single case of cancer in history had ever been caused by a lack of chemotherapy. And so that was a devastating, realization. And I think that we have to, come around quickly to the realization that the soil within our gut is actually the mechanism by which we produce health. And when we undermine the soil, the plant life dies. And in this case, that happens to be us. And so we have to really be sobered by the reality that we're undermining specific niches of the soil organisms and the soil vitality within us to produce this cancer epidemic.
Wow. And you're talking about the soil that we grow our food in, or are you talking about soil that gets in our system?
I'm talking about the soil that we grow our food in indirectly, but ultimately I'm talking about the organic soil that should be your intestinal environment. So your gut, if you look at your stool, that is compost. This is the ultimate soil within you. And so when you flush the toilet, how the heck did it start looking like that? Like you just ate a few hours ago and it looked like, beets and sauerkraut and everything else on your plate and cabbage and all these colors, and it comes out looking like soil. You are a composting machine for the microbial intelligence within you. And just as you put compost into your garden expecting life to be more abundant, we have so forgotten that process in our bodies. And so we keep taking drugs and supplements as this kind of end stage management of diseases that are manifesting from a lack of soil health within our intestinal organic garden. And we're accelerating that then by destroying the actual soils of the earth, by which now our food system is lacking the nutrients that would fuel our diverse ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, microbiome soils within us. And we've laced those foods with antibiotics, namely the herbicides, most specifically Roundup and glyphosate.
Yeah, this whole perspective is interesting because it's a great comparison to the 1600s and, the flat earth and how we kind of even look at physicians. I remember when I used to go to a doctor 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and he didn't give me an antibiotic for what I was feeling sick for, I would get angry because I was like, I know that's the quick solution. And we have this whole thing that, you go to your doctor, he prescribes you something and it fixes you. And even in this whole pandemic, we know that the comorbidities make you more, more susceptible to death. We know smoking and obesity and diabetes, and yet the UK government and all the governments all talking about vaccines. They're not talking about why don't we get healthier? Why don't we exercise? Why don't we eat better? Why don't we do this? When those factors could make a massive difference. We're still in this whole, write me a prescription type mentality, and we look at doctors in a way where we're not being proactive about our health. And I don't know, it's a very serious paradigm shift that needs to happen. But like you said, it probably will take a long time, right? Because even as kids, we're taught, you go to the doctor and he makes you better, right?
Yeah, I think the power has definitely been taken away from the individual to pursue health. And so with the marbled halls and the white coats and the stethoscopes and all the fancy trappings of MRI machines and CT scans and billions of dollars of laboratories, we give the impression that we know what the hell is going on. And the reality is we have no clue, because we have been going down this wrong avenue of education and believing that the human system is this isolated system that has to fight off disease, and most importantly, it needs an immune system to kill all microorganisms around it so that it doesn't die, so we don't get an infection. That is the mentality that is out there, both in the physician, the scientist, and the public still. And yet we know as of 30 years ago that, oh my gosh, a human can't survive unless the microorganisms within it are thriving in massive biodiversity. And in the last 15 years, it's been mind-blowing to realize that's not isolated to our gut. In fact, we have bacteria, fungi, viruses teeming in every single organ of our body to produce health. And in fact, when we start to slip into disease, the microbiome goes into an adaptation stress response system to try to recover our health. Alzheimer's brains, when you section those and you look at the most damaged part of the brain, the thing that has come to help is a yeast form of Candida glabrata that has now shifted to a mycelial, fungal hyphae form that has built a network of mycelial-like root system around the damaged portion of the brain to try to bring nutrients and fuel resource to that damaged area of the brain. And so we have a feared yeast that we are terrified in hospital systems we're trying to eradicate all the time, finding out that that's actually what's trying to help recover the brain of this Alzheimer's patient as they start to decline. And so we've now seen that in breast cancer. The bacteria that shows up to try to recover the health of the breast cancer is something called mycoplasma radiotolerans, or Mycobacterium radiotolerans. And that species of bacteria is able to thrive in the acidic environment around a breast cancer, and it's able to try to bring again nutrients and fuel production and communication into that space. We now know that the more sterile you make that patient, the less radiotolerance that's present, the faster that woman will die of metastatic cancer. And so as you undermine not just the gut soils, but the soils that are within us, the fact that there's microbiome within your brain is just like, that's heresy in my education, just from the early 1990s, that's farther back than I thought for a second. When I said that, I thought that was going to be really recent. But as it turns out, we are so slow to change our behavior because we keep seeing in the hospital, for example, examples of here's an infection. If I don't treat that infection, this patient is going to die. And so we forget then to back up and say the reason that patient has an infection is because we so damaged the soil system that there's now weed-like growth of a couple of organisms, and we're going to go in and try to wipe out the weeds. And the response is going to be more and more aggressive weeds and more drug-resistant weeds. And that's, of course, exactly what I see now when I'm working with farmers all the time now in their soil systems. When I go out into a farm on a conventional landscape, it's not unusual for us to see these, Roundup resistant weeds that are taking over farms. They can be the size of Christmas trees, these weeds with like trunk-like size things. They've been so forced into this extreme effort to recover the biology of this dying soil system. As soon as you stop trying to kill them, 1 year later, that soil no longer has that weed present. The need for that weed went away because the soil began to recover its ecosystem. And so if in our damage control, we need a moment of antibiotics, we need to, instead of saying now you're better from your pneumonia, we need to say, we just made things worse. And you're going to come back next year or in a few months with something much worse. And unfortunately, that may be cancer because we just wiped out your microbiome again. And so right now, as you leave the hospital, we're putting you on a 3-month journey into microbiome diversification. So we would like you to change and modify your daily behavior so that the nature is starting to bring more and more microbial diversity into your life every day. If that was the discharge instructions from the hospital, we would stop the recidivism that we see in medicine. The same way we see recidivism in prisons, because we don't fix the underlying cause of socioeconomic collapse, lack of education, and all of this that would heal the whole prison system. That recidivism in the hospitals is tragic on a whole nother level. It's such a burnout career to be a hospitalist. And so as an internal medicine doctor, I spent so many years in hospitals and ICUs. And when you are admitting the same patient for the same freaking condition for the 4th time in a single month, you start to really give up hope. You feel like the finger in the dike of this dam that's breaking of chronic disease across you. And as we see, cancer now reaching 1 in 2 males in the United States will now be diagnosed with cancer before they die. That's mind-boggling. Like that's a doubling of our cancer rate just in the last 30 years or something. So it's so fast now that we're seeing this explosion. Simultaneously, we're seeing almost vertical increases in neurologic degeneration, Alzheimer's, certainly Parkinson's, but down into our children, attention deficit hyperactivity, autism, and the like. Our population is failing to build healthy brains. And so the antidepressants, the anti-anxieties, the sleep medicines, the sexual disorders, all of this explosion of dysfunction of the brain is because the organism is losing the soil system. And so we need to radically change our viewpoint from, we just fixed the pneumonia, to we just did a whack-a-mole situation where we whacked down the mole for a second, but it's going to pop up over here because we're going to have another problem. And the same thing is happening on a global scale. If you look at the recent Netflix release on, I think it's called Bill's Brain or something, it's on Bill Gates and this feel-good story about him and the Gates Foundation on what they're trying to do to eradicate polio and these viral infections by these very intensive, almost military efforts of vaccination in India and areas there. And what you see is they stamp it out in one thing. And in there, he's showing, can't remember who he's talking to at that moment, have been maybe one of his investors or something, but he's showing that, hey, we eradicated here, but then it popped up over here. So then we implement our system over here in this county and we eradicated that, but then it popped up back over here. So they're doing the whack-a-mole game, not just in a single patient now, but in the whole populations where they can't suppress, the infection because they're not realizing that they're playing on a two-dimensional chessboard when in fact biology is three-dimensional. And the microorganisms are through the soil, water, and air systems. And the reason they're there is because we've damaged the system. And so we didn't eradicate, polio, for example, in the United States until we changed our water systems. And when we chlorinated our pools and stopped, the weed-like growth of microorganisms in swimming pools, we would have still had polio today. It wasn't until we changed the water that it went away. We have this story that the polio vaccine made polio go away. No, we changed 1,000 things in medical management around the tonsils and adenectomies and radiation for acne that was going on at the time and everything else. We stopped doing all of that. The children recovered an immune system and we changed their water environment and polio went away. And so we're seeing the inability for that same polio vaccine to eradicate it in India because we're not fixing the underlying problem, which is an abnormal, unbalanced terrain of water and soil systems because there's so much chemical toxicity within those developing countries now.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about maybe vaccines and then pharmaceutical companies. I mean, you talked about kind of this classic relationship we have with doctors where you go to the doctor and they fix you. That's unfortunately, and you probably know this from being in medicine, it's kind of backed up 10x by the pharmaceutical companies. I had Dr. Michael Greger on a couple weeks ago, famous doctor, who advocates, plant-based diets because the numbers tell him it's the right thing to do. But he said, Brian, the best thing that a doctor does is a blood pressure test because they adjust a statin, 10 minutes, the patient's in and out. Everybody makes money, including the BMW dealership down the road. The doctor makes money. There's not necessarily any conspiracy going on. It's just it works for everyone. And the patient seems like they're happy. Oh, you fixed me. You did something good for me. And this whole industry just keeps going, and it's almost got a mind of its own. And it's almost like a living organism that wants to live and grow and get bigger, and it stops anything kind of in its path, which is probably why I can't talk about vaccines on, mainstream media or even social media platforms. So you got that running, and then now you've got the potential of a vaccine, which again brings these companies in there as well. Maybe speak a little bit on that pharmaceutical industry and how it affects the whole relationship we have with doctors. And then I'd love to get in and talk about the whole concept of a vaccine and what's right about it and what's wrong about it.
Yeah, so the industry is certainly a machine. And what you just described, you could have easily just been standing in front of a medical school class describing cancer. It is a machine that is self-proliferating, self-serving, and self-reinforcing. And so there's nothing within the growth of the machine that can slow itself down. And so it is a perpetual motion machine that takes more and more energy to drive it, and it can't produce its own energy, so it has to extract it from the environment around it. That's how a cancer grows. And so the medical system, and I would argue the prison system, and I would argue the military, industrial complex, all have the same problem in that they are chasing symptoms of a collapsing society in those cases, and constantly winning the game because they make more money for those that are running the system. And so it is not a conspiracy theory at all. It is capitalism at its best work, really. But it goes deeper than capitalism. It's humanism. The humanism, philosophy that we live is that we are in conflict with everything around us, and we need to kill everything else so that there's more room for us. And in that now, with just what we've talked about over the last few minutes altogether, you start to realize we are in all of those systems destroying biodiversity. And so we can destroy biodiversity in human societies. We can destroy biodiversity within microbial systems. And in so doing, in the monocropping type behavior of humans, as we plant just corn and soybean and wheat across 10 million acres of farmland, more every year, we are undermining what biology and life is really intended to do, which is to do biodiversity. And so we are not only have a machine, that machine is a machine of simplification. It's always trying to get to simpler and simpler algorithms to produce, a disease modification so that it fits everybody. And when you mentioned earlier that, we saw that one of the main likelihoods of mortality from what we were calling corona deaths was not coronavirus at all. It was actually comorbidities of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and kidney disease, which none of those three have anything to do with the physiology of the virus per se. And so it was begging the question of, well, why are those three populations the ones? Why isn't it the patients that have chronic asthma, emphysema, and all of that are the top ones there? Why isn't it the lung patients that are so at risk for this respiratory virus, as it's been called? And as it turns out, those three categories of patients have to be put on the same two drugs. And so, as I was saying earlier, the machine is trying to find simpler and simpler algorithms so that the complexity of a day of a physician can be executed quickly. So you need a doctor to come in and see do pattern recognition and then immediately say, these are the two drugs you need. And in the very extraordinarily complex disease pathophysiologies of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular disease, diabetes in the liver, and kidney disease, all three of those have now been boiled down to a clinical algorithm that you just have to put them on a statin drug and an ACE inhibitor blood pressure medicine, and you've won the game as a physician. You can check those two boxes and say, I just practiced the standard of care for any of those. Now you're talking about nearly 1 billion patients worldwide with one of those three conditions. And so we've boiled those three conditions globally down to two medications, and those two medications pertinently change the terrain of our lungs to overexpress the receptor for coronavirus. And so we have changed the terrain, we have changed the physiology of humanity through this narrow, blinders on perspective, this reductionist, belief system that pharmacy is going to fix everything. And in so doing, we made the whole population prone to a disease, event that actually had very little to do with the virus at the beginning. And it had to do with a change in the terrain, just as the weed is not the thing that comes and attacks the farm. The farm is failing, the soil is failing, and therefore the weed shows up. Corona is a natural part of our micro ecosystems communication network, okay? So microbiome, bacteria, fungi, all of these are communicating. Corona is there as a communication network. If it starts to develop an abnormal relationship with our terrain, it's because we've modified ourselves. And nowhere is that more obvious in this pandemic than those two drugs of the statins and the ACE inhibitors.
Wow. All right. Before we jump into vaccines, then give me your thoughts on coronavirus, because again, originally we saw the predictions from Imperial College and the computer models of 2 million people dying in the US. And then we saw those numbers come way down, but we still see, especially in the media these days, that I sometimes I can just see that the articles, they're getting crazy clicks because the second wave, it's gets people scared again. But what is the reality of what we've actually seen with COVID-19 versus what people are being told by governments and what we expected?
The science is so multifaceted here, and to say that I have all this science at my fingertips would be inaccurate in that I have a lot of numbers that I've pulled and have colleagues that have been pulling aggressively for months now to come up with a stable model for what's been happening around the world. And it certainly is telling a different tale than we're seeing in the media. But it's not to say that people aren't dying. It is actually to say that people are dying, and people are dying related to an exposure to a respiratory virus. There's huge problems with our diagnostic tool here. PCR is the tool that's been used globally to determine if somebody has COVID or not. And PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's an amplification technique for finding small amounts of DNA. It is a very big dilemma because the presence of that DNA doesn't mean you're ever going to get sick from that virus. Most of us will have that DNA in our bloodstream for a period of time as we go into our genetic update. As we're taking this virus in, we proliferate the virus to get it into enough cells in the body, and then we reach homeostasis where we've taken in enough of that genetic information that we stop making it. And so, or we make tiny amounts of it. And so that that balance with that DNA has nothing to do with whether we're going to develop disease or not. From, again, most people exposed to COVID were asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.